Hello, everyone. It's been yet another very long week full of forest fires and political drama, but it's Friday, so cheers. We're here this evening with former U.S. Poet Laureate Robert Pinsky, whose new memoir, Jersey Breaks, is both an intimate self-portrait and a huge poetic understanding of American culture. Robert will be in conversation this evening with former Vermont Poet Laureate Chard deNiord. Chard is a co-founder of the New England College MFA program in poetry. He is the author of the poetry collections Asleep at the Fire, Sharp Golden Thorn, Night Mowing, The Double Truth, and Interstate. His book, Sad Friends and Drowned Lovers, Staple Songs, is a collection of interviews with American poets. His second collection of interviews with poets is I Would Lie to You If I Could, interviews with 10 American poets. He lives in Westminster West, and he will introduce Robert. Please join me in welcoming Robert Pinsky and Chard deNiord.
Hi, everybody.
Hello, Robert.
Hi, Chard. I guess it's up to us now.
Yeah, I guess it is. We're all alone. It's such a great pleasure to talk to you and to see you this afternoon. And I want to thank you for being here during this Zoom conversation. As one of America's, I'm going to do a little intro of you. As one of America's most beloved and eminent poets, translator, man of letters, teacher, anthologist, essayist, literary ambassador, family man, and clear-eyed witness to America's zeitgeist and character over the past half-century, you have written both personally and publicly with a parallax vision that has divined, on the one hand, what Walt Whitman called the genius of America's common people, and on the other, what the critic J.D. McClatchy called Robert Pinsky's gift for transforming those, quote, those autobiographical myths we make out of memories into poetry. Elected Poet Laureate of the United States in 1997, your 3-year tenure in this position was marked by the ambitious efforts to prove the power of poetry, not just as an intellectual pursuit in the ivory tower, but as a meaningful and integral part of American life, end of quote. You put this conviction into practice by founding the Favorite Poem Project, which you, along with poet Maggie Dietz, partook in exemplary demotic as an exemplary demotic project of asking people from all walks around the country, all walks of life, to name and talk about their favorite poems for an anthology you and Maggie then published called Americans' Favorite Poems. Your most recent book, your 38th, I think it's your 38th, it may be your 40th, but you have a new wonderful book coming out as well that you can talk a little bit about. It's a wonderfully engaging memoir titled Jersey Breaks, about which your friend and former Long Branch, New Jersey neighbor Bruce Springsteen praises as truly the voice of the Jersey Shore. Yes, but it's also, I think, and it's important to add, an invaluable, universally relevant and trenchant story about a kid who grew up on the Jersey Shore by his wits, his ear, his love of poetry, and his indomitable sweet will that led him ultimately, against enormous odds, to becoming a national literary and cultural treasure. First question for you, Robert.
Hey.
Your life and career has been filled with prodigious achievements, multiple honors, and selfless contributions to poetry. Too much to cover here. So I'll try to focus on parts of the whole, or what are referred to as synecdoches in poetry terms, of your life and career. I'd like to start with a question which I also asked you in an interview we engaged in about a month ago, which will be published in the July issue of World Literature Today. You cited something Stephen Dedalus says in James Joyce's Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, which you read when you were 12, I believe you told me, and has served as a kind of credo for you ever since. Could you repeat that quote and then elaborate a bit on its enduring significance for you?
Yeah.
I'll just leave it at that, and I think you remember that quote.
I do. I don't think I was 12 years old. I was probably 16 or 17 years old. But when Stephen Dedalus is asked, I think he's asked for a definition of the word history, and Stephen, combining Stephen's, the characters, and Joyce's blend of arrogance and insight, he says, history is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake. And that, it may not be a slogan that can take you everywhere, but it became something very important to me. And when I think about Mark Twain writing about American culture, the American racial divide, the provincialism and vulgarity that the Duke and the Dauphin exploit in Huckleberry Finn, when I think of Melville, I think of Willa Cather in The Song of the Lark, and really in all of her books, writing about the meanness and provinciality of American small towns. And at the same time, like Faulkner in the Hamlet, treasuring some aspect of democracy that, against other tendencies, says, but it's possible to make the very best available to everyone. So I guess I did a kind of homemade American version of Stephen Dedalus saying, history is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake. And I suppose that as I've gotten older and then old, I understand there are limitations to that. When I think of Isaac Babel writing about riding with the Red Cavalry, this Jewish writer riding with the Cossacks who were fighting the whites, it was partly a misplaced faith in the revolution that drove Babel to try to awaken from European history. And that has been one of the notions and a notion of art that's been very important to me.
Thank you.
I thought you were going to say, no, Robert, that's not the quotation I meant.
That is the quotation.
Because I was getting very
you know,
eloquent about it. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, you went on to talk about the source of everything also in that interview, by which you go on to explain specifically as the enmity and anti-Semitism you witness in your neighborhood in Long Branch. And you call at some point here, the crazy, the densely crazy power that ruled the world. And it seems that you came to a very sharp consciousness of this when you were pretty young. And one of the wonderful things about far back you go, and one of the topics you talk about a lot and so engagingly is your Zadie and your grandfather. And I know he was in a
one was a Zadie Pop, and he was the one who was indicted. My father called him Pop. I had a Zadie who was just Zadie, but Zadie Pop was, when I knew him, he had a bar, but he had been a criminal for a good part of his life. He worked for the gangster Longies Willman, who was in the Prohibition, was the kingpin of the illegal liquor industry in New Jersey, and particularly in Newark. And the nightmare of history for many Americans has involved controlled or legal substances, so that there's a generation of immigrants for whom the Pacino in the movie Scarface is important. And that awakening, the nightmare, in my neighborhood, that power, the insane power that rules the world, is culture. It's everything. And I was so fortunate to have a conversation about this book, Jersey Breaks, with Orlando Patterson, the wonderful sociologist. And Orlando was interested in the fact that where I lived on the, you could call it the shores of a white island or of a black island, or you could call it a mostly segregated low-class neighborhood. So that I lived in a multi-family frame house across the street from one end of Monmouth Avenue, in the corner, where there was Dr. Julius McKelvey, the Black doctor in town, who had been active in the NAACP, I learned later. To me, he was just a man in a three-piece suit who would appear in this nice house where his office was across the street. And at the other end of Monmouth Avenue was the Tally Ho Tavern, a very rough bar, famous because there someone in a disagreement had bitten the finger of a policeman off. In urban lore, that's a good example of the good use of a preposition. And the sexy allure of it turns out that generations of American dancers have been named Little Egypt. And one of them was on a poster to be performing at the Tally Ho Tavern. So even on Monmouth Avenue, this end and that end, there was the cultural force of whatever Little Egypt represented, the cultural force of Dr. McKelvey, who, among other things, tried to integrate the Atlantic Ocean, because in Long Branch in those days, there were black and white beaches. And as Orlando Patterson pointed out, it was an unusual moment in American history where redlining had not been quite perfected by the real estate agency, so that I not only saw Black people every day when I looked out our front door or out the window, I knew them. I went to their houses. They came to my house. They're unique, and I don't want to idealize it. It isn't that we thought everything was great or that we could. I was gradually getting aware of how the extent to which I was controlled by an Eastern European surname, that on a list, Pinsky could cause problems that, say, Hester or Williams might not, on a list, on a written list. But in person, if you saw Jerry Hester or Grady Williams, their skin color would limit them in a way that my name might limit or define me. And that was much more serious. All these things are not invisible to a child. They're visible early on when you're quite small. So culture in its nightmarish power, as well as in its benefits and its beauties, is available from very early on. And the Favorite Poem Project, as you said, was my attempt to appreciate my country's, in a way, our public school system, the education I got, and that there were people like Emily Dickinson Willa Cather, certainly Mark Twain, whose work I read over and over again, to whom all those nightmarish contradictions and categories were not invisible, but they could be rich and amusing and fun, and they could be dealt with. You could try to understand them. I'm very happy to see in the chat my friend Connie Post appears from California, someone else in Washington, and the poet Win Cooper quotes me quite right. Win lives in Somerville, and apparently
Hello, Win.
this is so germane to what we're talking about, the way of culture. Apparently, I live in Cambridge, Mass, and Win lives in the neighboring town where one of my kids and some of my grandkids live, Somerville. And Win quotes me as having said, "Oh yeah, Somerville, the Brooklyn of Cambridge." And that you have to have been thinking, you have to have been subjected to a lot of cultural experience and information to understand, if you're from Bucharest or Austin, you might not get it, but you might. And that as Brooklyn is now the formerly lower and now the hip and intellectual and artistic magnet in New York, so Somerville has become, where Harvard Square has become quite boring and deadly and dead. Davis Square in Somerville is very lively, and if you wanted to find out where are the poets and musicians and painters and all that locally, they'd be in Brooklyn. Oh, I mean Somerville, same idea. And that's a little glint of the constantly shifting cultural realities. And in the Stephen Dedalus quotation, he uses the participial, trying to awake, which suggests that culture is always in motion. Culture is not a canon, some list that a literary critic or a professor makes. Culture is the various, diverse, accumulated changes happening at all moments in an ongoing way.
That's really wonderfully put, Robert. I'm fascinated by your early education as well as your later education. You claim, I think it's in Jersey Breaks, that you were a C student in
I was a
what,
CRB
elementary?
student. The memorable grade that I still resent is every marking period I got a D in citizenship. And I thought, as I remain patriotic, I thought that was a terrible insult. And I could make speeches from quite early in life saying, why don't they call it deportment or conduct?
But
Citizenship, as soon as I learned the word euphemism, I knew it was that. And yeah, I got, the only subject I got A's in were, for significant years, were music and woodshop. I can remember Mr. Porter, or was it Mr. McWithy in woodshop, saying, tell the class what you got in what your grade was. And I said, I got an A, Mr. Mac. He said, that's right. He said, this kid isn't the most gifted in the room, but he tries hard. He does his work. He does what he's asked. So yeah, I was, I still don't completely understand why, but I didn't like doing what I was supposed to.
well, it's clear that you followed your own curriculum. and
Yeah.
then continued to follow it. And really, there's no more civic-minded poet or artist that I can think of than you in the country. So I hope some of those early teachers lived long enough to witness that. I'd like to shift gears a little bit to a kind of larger national subject here. We live in a time where there's more poetry in the literary marketplace than ever before in this country. More journals, more books, more readings, more MFA programs, over 300 now across the country. The business and proliferation of poetry has become literally a drowned river. That's a river that floods its banks. Yet, there's still only a relatively small fraction of Americans who actually read poetry. Could you talk a little bit what about appears to be this kind of disconnect between the lovers of poetry in this country, the small fraction I just mentioned, and the more general subject? And I know you've tried to certainly address this in the American Poem Project, and I probably have the best insights of anybody on this.
There's a wonderful book by Joan Shelley Rubin, Songs of Ourselves, Belknap, Harvard University Press. And she examines the mythological aspects of, oh, nobody reads it. That in some ways, lots of people read it. And I can remember years ago, I published somewhere a piece in the opinion piece in the New York Times, where I pointed out that if you take a random elevator of people, a little room of Americans, and you ask everybody to recite some poetry, certainly, depending on the generation, they'll have popular songs. Some can do Dylan, some can do Little Richard, some can do Cole Porter, some can do rap music, and a certain number will be able to quote from Geoffrey Chaucer's prologue to the Canterbury Tales, or they'll be able to do Further in Summer Than the Birds, Pathetic from the Grass, a minor nation celebrates its unobtrusive mass. And it is, after all, a spoken art. So it is easier to measure book sales than it is to measure how many people, how often mutter something to themselves, the way we hum and sing to ourselves. And usually in any art, there's always a lot of crap that is extremely esteemed and a few good things that keep going. I remember, I'm grateful to my college teacher, Paul Fussell, telling a class of New Jersey college students, of course, in the 18th century, if you asked literary people, to name some important writers, they would name Mr. Cibber, Mr. Ambrose Phillips. They wouldn't name Mr. Pope or Mr. Swift. And I think possibly still the most important sales of a book of poems, certainly the author, he had his own weekly column, he had his own radio show. In the early days of television, he had his own poetry TV show. And his book of poems sold 1 million copies when 1 million copies really meant something. And he doubtless was in many ways, Joan Rubin writes about this, the most popular poet in American history. And I think very few, I know that many of my MFA students don't recognize the name Edgar Guest. Just as many of them don't recognize the name Rod McEwen, who was very popular and had hit songs in the, I guess it was in the 70s. And now there's internet sensations of that kind. where I keep forgetting the name, so that I'm just a hopeless highbrow. I'm a snob. I don't care about book sales. I don't care, to be really honest. I don't put a big stock in prizes. I'm grateful for the ones I've won. I'm grateful for the title Poet Laureate, but I wouldn't overestimate it. So that whether people read or don't read, and in what numbers they read or don't read, I don't think it's as important as we produced Walt Whitman, who is a model for poets in Asian languages, in Spanish and Portuguese, and he has inspired, in the Favorite Poem Project, we have a Chinese filmmaker who remembers reading Whitman during the most oppressive period of the Cultural Revolution. And he sent a passage in translation to a girl he was falling in love with. And she told their teacher, who was also a member of the secret police, and that filmmaker wound up in jail for a while. That's how important Walt Whitman was to him. That evidence is much more important to me than book sales or the other measures. I'm not impressed by it because I'm not impressed by Edgar Guest. He was an expert. He knew his book was called A Heap of Living. It takes a heap of living to make a house a home. I'm more interested in Marianne Moore than I am in Edgar Guest. Maybe that's why I got bad grades. In high school, I would have been, if I were the kind of person who was interested in Edgar Guest, I would have been interested in what was the assigned passage in the history book. And instead, I just told myself I'll read some other passage. My favorite statement about Jersey Breaks is probably Ron Slade in his On the Seawall. He said, this book is about doing what you want to do and getting away with it. I know what he means.
Which you have. Which you have. I would like to go back very early with you to when you were in your crib, actually, and just becoming conscious of sound for the first time and falling in love with sound and the rhythms of sound, which then became really a kind of obsession for you for the rest of your life, even into your love of music and your saxophone playing. And of course, you've written 2 books about sound, one called The Singing School, and the other one, just remind me of the title, Sound and...
Sounds of Poetry.
Yeah, right.
Sounds
The Sounds
of Poetry.
Of poetry. And so could you just talk about that love affair you've had with sound, and how you've sort of grafted sounds into your psyche and your memory for your entire life, and in your poetry you've been primarily a formal poet, but sound has just been one of your muses, I would dare to say, throughout your life.
Sound has been one of your muses, I would dare to say, throughout your life. English sentences have melodies. Sound has been one of the... Sound has become one of your muses, I would dare to say, throughout your life. And there's something nice about the parenthetical, I would dare to say. But then, and it's not just sound, it's the sound of sentences, which I believe an infant concentrates on very hard, long before the infant can actually speak. The infant is thinking about those cadences. And sound was one of your muses, so to speak, early in your life. And then you start thinking about harmony as well as melody. Sound was among your muses early in your life, because then you can get another M in. I think among the muses you felt in your early life, and what can I do? What's life backwards? File or fill. I think you are filling yourself with the music of sentences early in your life. And the part of the mind for me that makes poems is always saying, what is that word inside out or backwards? So life gave me file and file gave me full. And muses makes me think of muses, but also that zzz, that buzzing sound. It seems to me that music was maybe that the music of sentences was, so to speak, at one time of your life, a kind of muse. Because you see, you have to separate music from muse, because it'll be too corny formally if they're close to one another. And I hear this in Moore and in William Carlos Williams. I hear it in the famous poem by Robert Hayden when he's almost in pentameter and not quite. Sundays too, my father got up early. And it's, as I say in the book, I have learned that if you recite Wallace Stevens or Emily Dickinson to an infant, when you're cradling the infant and holding the kid, you get a response exactly as if you're singing. That the verse, the fact that there are words and that it has a kind of pattern that's doing something pleasing, a 6-week-old baby responds to that. It's that fundamental. So something particularly intense and almost deranged happened to me with the sounds of words, the consonants chopping and shaping the vowels. But I think it's there in everybody. Like dancing and sports, we tend to get well-meaning teaching makes us forget it. That after a certain year, people say, oh, I don't understand poetry, or I can't dance, or I'm not athletic. When you're 2 years old,
Yeah.
you like all of the above.
Yeah.
You like throwing the ball. You like singing. You do like poetry. It's only education that deprives you of those things.
That's wonderful, Robert. I hope someone was writing that poem down that you just extemporaneously composed here for us. You know, in one of your chapters in Jersey Briggs, you talk about your bar mitzvah and reciting that passage from Isaiah.
Yes.
And the influence, just following up on what you just said, that had on you as far as just some kind of foreign sound, it must have sounded like when you were learning Hebrew then, but also knew the translation of, but just the sound of that passage from Isaiah must have had a deep effect on you.
A deep effect all summer long. My bar mitzvah was in October. All summer, I was memorizing and learning to chant in a language I didn't understand. So to this day, at the age of 82, somewhere back there is Keomar Hashemayim Kisi
Thank you.
Esponeho.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Keomar, I don't know what that means. Now I've read translations. I know that while I was piping, I was chanting words that said, God is disgusted by your hollow worship. Your new moons and your celebrations. It's like watching somebody cut a dog's throat. It's repellent to God. And I was singing that God doesn't like meaningless or hollow, mere perfunctory worship.
To a 14-year-old kid, those Philippics of Isaiah must have made quite an impression on you.
It was just a lot of sounds.
Yeah. Speaking of music, I was talking with Todd Heron the other day, your friend Todd, who's Maggie
Wonderful,
Deetz's husband,
wonderful
a
songwriter.
wonderful poet and a songwriter as well, and performer. And I said, Todd, you're a good friend of Robert's. Do do you have any questions that you might have for him? And he mentioned a lot of the stuff we've just been talking about, but he did say that you knew this scraggly-headed singer with a guitar in Long Beach, who was a little younger than you, but who went on to become quite a master of sound, if you will, in music. Bruce Springsteen, who's written this wonderful comment on the cover of your book. Truly one of the New Jersey Shore's true voices. So I wondered what did you think of Bruce early on?
Well, I didn't know him. I think my brother did. My brother was a sort of surfer here, my 10 years younger brother. No, Bruce and I met when, thanks to David Daniel, we performed at Fairleigh Dickinson's in New Jersey. And Bruce is like me. He marvels at how you can start with so little and get so much, do so much. And he is a wonderful writer. His autobiography, which was his Broadway show is based on that book. He's a serious reader and a serious writer. And there's nothing silly about his work, his writing, and his music. It's about reality. And I think we got along very well, and that performance, some of it is on YouTube. If you search YouTube for Pinsky and Springsteen, unlikely enough you do see us performing together, and sort of Wesley Stace is the MC. I quote my own joke in Jersey Breaks. I quote myself often saying, I can remember saying it when we had the poetry night at the White House. I'll think it sometimes, and I think just that I've made a living with this. I'll say to myself, all of this just for ta-da, 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 ta-da. And that messing around with the sounds of words and trying to be a musician opened up so much. I think that I recognize that in Bruce. He paid wonderful attention to my work. He courted my work in a very good way. And there's a similar feeling of, whoa. It turns out that doing what I felt like doing in rock and roll or in poetry turned out to have meaning. And it turned out to produce, in his case, a fortune. And in my case, not really, an extraordinarily blessed life. No good luck lasts forever, but it's remarkable to me that I have had so much good fortune after having that period of being, in the dumb class in school and just seeming unpromising, and that a big part of it is a knack. I mean, for Bruce, it was certainly words and music. For me, it's words, and I'm so glad that thanks to the producer, Richard Connolly, to musicians like Lawrence Hobgood, Vijay Iyer, the great New Jersey drummer, Andrew Cyril, I've had a chance to work with jazz musicians as well. And Todd Herron understands what I'm talking about very well, that music and poetry are sister arts. They are very close. They're not exactly the same, but they are very close sisters.
I don't know if everyone knows you're an accomplished saxophonist. And sometimes that line between music and verbal music can get a little blurred, but also there's a powerful connection between the two. And I would love to talk to about a poem that Bruce Smith commented on to me. I sent it to him, your wonderful poem, Forgiveness, that you included at the end of our World Literature Today interview. And if you could read that poem, I would then like to read to you Bruce Smith's comment about that marriage between verbal music and jazz that he sensed in that poem.
I'm so pleased and gratified that your attention and Bruce's. This is the poem, and as you say, it will be published in World Literature Today, and in May, Farrar Straus will include it in the book of poems, Proverbs of Limbo. This is forgiveness. Forgiveness. The mind skitters, its one rudder being its own voice. The great fascist poet taught me about free verse, trying to concentrate on the forgiving of an unforgivable crime. In a lecture by Emmanuel Levinas, I drift off into Keely Smith being Cherokee. The desire for vers libre, says Ezra Pound in his hectoring way, is, quote, quantity reasserting itself after years of starvation, end quote. Reading that, I got the idea. Just like in music, longer is different from higher. Longer is different from higher, like with long E. And it was called quantity. I could hear it, the third syllable longer, the first one stressed by higher pitch. Bitterness, Cherokee, Popinjay. I don't pretend I was thinking about the Trail of Tears or any other unforgivable crime. I was thinking about how well she imitates Louis Prima's pelvis forward walk, mocking the magic of it while singing like an angel in a prom dress. And how great it would be to write something that funny and impassioned. The cadences and quantities of Pound's Exile's Letter break my heart as a ritual of truth, the remote spoken ceremony of atonement. At the same time, I scorn that nostalgic celebration of drunken friendship among exquisite diplomats of an ancient ruling class. And Pound using starvation as a figure of speech. The airy dynamo of song animates the shadows. And speaking of shadows, who has a right to forgive? White soldiers took away the Arapahoe's horses. In old Ukraine, the nationalists first mutilated some Jews, then made them dance and sing naked before killing them, as a way of showing what they'd like to do to the Poles. Or was it the invading Germans? Is the point humiliation beyond forgiveness? Do the damned impregnate the enslaved to make an unforgivable point? Also to deny it? Even poor John Keats, in his letters, enjoys a little minor Jew baiting. Who do I think I am to forgive him? After all, I am him. He, too, was the child of a New Jersey optician. And please do me a favor. Don't tell me, no, he wasn't.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you. Powerful, powerful poem, Robert. This is what Bruce Smith, a wonderful poet who teaches at Syracuse University and the author of many powerful books of poetry himself and friend
Indeed,
of
yes.
yours, wrote, I think Robert composes more musically than the narrative, using motifs. It skitters rather than accrues or advances horizontally. It introduces motifs, Ezra Pound, Unforgivable, Crimes, the Cherokee, Free Verse, Jews. He gets the idea from music. Longer is different from higher. That is about duration and pitch, musical notation and musicality in general. And he proceeds not so much to weave and layer, but to introduce a motif, to riff on that motif, and then return to another motif that acts like chord changes or changes in tempo. He's hyper aware of his own making, the vowel and consonants, as well as the history and culture that are sounded here as atonement or truth of our complications or being in and experiencing each other's lives, even if they are fictive. Keats is Optician's son.
Yes. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you for letting there be space for that way of holding meanings and feelings together. Bruce is describing the way I, in this poem, and often approach the nightmare of history so much. The poem is so much about the nightmare of history. The rubbing out of the Arapahoe's culture, maybe at one extreme, or the Holocaust, wherever you want to put it, an extreme. And in some history I read, it did say that those nationalists, when they first tortured and tormented and made those Jews mutilated that they were, sing and dance, then killed them, the point was less hating Jews than wanting to show what they wish they could do to the Poles or the Germans. And that nightmare, without it, we don't have our languages. Without history, we don't have Little Egypt the Dancer and music. And the nightmare and the beauty are always simultaneous. So in one way, I read Pound's beautiful, beautiful, the epitome of really great free verse, The Exile's Letter. And then I can look at it another way. And who are these drunken aristocrats that I should care about them? They're lonely for one another. And they like to have beautiful serving boys bring them wine when they get sentimental. And for people like me, John Keats's letters amount to a kind of holy text. And then there are also times when he makes a joke of him. He says, I can be as mercenary as any literary Jew. I've heard far worse. And Keats, he was a sort of lower middle class, but his father married the bar owner's daughter. He was very angry that his inheritance wasn't coming to him the right way. And there are many senses in which, he was the equivalent of a New Jersey optician's child. And who isn't? Well, I guess Philip Sidney isn't. But as in a lot of European novels, the social class that produces art is often one of great ambiguities, imperfections, and thwarted aspirations to get above itself. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Bruce. He sent that to me the next day after I sent him that poem, Robert. Yeah. He immersed himself in it.
And it's beautifully not a paraphrase.
Yeah.
It's Thank you, Bruce, for not writing a paraphrase.
So Robert, your friend, another Robert Haas, and you collaborated for many years in translating poems of Czesław Miłosz, the Polish poet who won the Nobel Prize in 1980. Here's a profound stanza from Miłosz's poem Ars Poetica, which you and Haas translated, and which I think could serve also as your own Ars Poetica. The purpose of poetry is to remind us how difficult it is to remain just one person. For our house is open, there are no keys in the doors, and invisible guests come in at our will and out at will. What I'm saying here is not, I agree, poetry, as poems should be written rarely and reluctantly under unbearable duress, and only with the hope that good spirits, not evil ones, choose us for their instrument. Why does Miłosz's poem, why does Miłosz in this poem say, what I'm saying here is not, I agree, poetry? And also in a more general way, what was it like translating these eternal poems by Miłosz?
I imagine Czesław thinking to himself as he writes, what I know that what I'm writing here is not poetry. For poetry, I imagine him thinking very much like Frost's saying, I allude to this in Jersey Breaks, where Frost said, you must never call yourself a poet.
Right.
That is for other people to say. And Czesław is leaving it up to the reader to understand that the poem Ars Poetica is a poem. And I ascribe to, I'm glad to underwrite, to endorse, to attempt to live up to his saying that poetry is related to not being one person. Nobody is one person. You're your parents, you're their parents, as in the Larkin poem. They had some other faults just for you. And there's all your literal ancestors, but then there's my ancestor, Ezra Pound. And I enjoy calling him my ancestor because he would probably hate it, his anti-Semitic soul. But he said many good things about poetry. And the door is open. He comes into my poem. And I suppose to extend Czesław's figure of speech for a poem a bit more, I have to let Pound in. He said things I appreciate about the nature of verse, quantity as well as stress, where sometimes, the professor, the critic will say, oh, that's hard to understand. It's not hard to understand. Popinjay and Cherokee and bitterness, the first syllable is the highest and the third one is the longest. And it's not, if you let yourself hear it, there it is. He comes in and I enjoy acknowledging that he wrote great things, and I enjoy acknowledging that he was a fascist asshole. It was a pleasure to be able to have both of those things in there. And to go back to doing the things you want to do, I can say that. And I can say that I don't want to presume to forgive John Keats. And after all, he too was the son of a New Jersey optician. And if you don't get the sense in which it's true, have a nice time.
So this is just fascinating. These powerful influences and giants in poetry who have influenced you so deeply, and so many others like Keats and Pound are also at the same time a part of the dense craziness of history that you're wed to as a poet.
and of language.
End of language, yeah.
When Dickinson makes English almost explode, it's like Paul Celan writing German, not with the same pain, but that poem, Further in Summer Than the Birds, pathetic from the grass, a minor nation celebrates its unobtrusive mass. When August burning low, and it's something like ordinance does not be so gradual the grace, and August burning low, arise this spectral canticle. The grammar, the syntax itself,
I know it
collapses, and she's telling you something, she's showing you something so real in a kind of, let's call it a modal way that Bruce is talking about. How can you care about how many people at any given moment are reading that poem? Who cares when you have it there and you're putting it into your voice? She's giving you the thrill of having it in your voice. And it's almost, she's almost babbling. It's almost, I'm looking to see if I have it here. I've been misquoting it.
You're pretty
I'll
close.
make one more try. I can find it pretty easily in some other book, but I think it may be in this book of mine. Anyway, we don't need to quote Dickinson immediately, but August burning low.
Okay.
And so gradual the grace, it becomes a gentle legend, enhancing loneliness. It becomes a gentle, and she's talking about the sounds of crickets. So gradual the grace. And I enjoy even fumbling and misquoting after what she does with that language. It's part of her present to me, part of her gift to us. And the door is open. You can go in there.
Yeah. She
hasn't locked it.
Well, we have time for maybe one more quick question here, Robert. It's gone by so quickly. I don't know if many people know this, but you visited North Korea several years ago.
Amazingly enough, I did.
Which was a profound experience for you, I know. And I just wonder if you could say pretty briefly, without without generalizing or summarizing too much, what that experience was like for you and what you learned about Korea, specifically North Korea, during that visit that you, I don't know, gives you hope, that instructed you, that you carry.
It was the Manhai Festival. Manhai is for Koreans. He's like Thomas Jefferson. He wrote their Constitution. He's a great poet. He also is a great religious figure. He, among other things, abolished the requirement of celibacy for priests. That was all one person. And the Manhai Festival was, in a way, about the meaninglessness, yet the profound meaning of dividing the peninsula and dividing the people. And on the bus, it was an international festival. So on the bus, there we were, poets from Europe, from Africa, from Asia, all over the globe. We found that the lingua franca was Spanish. We talked Spanish to one another. And on the bus with us were poets from South Korea.
Wow.
Some of them born in the North with families in the North, and they were weeping as the bus approached that country. And as we got closer to the very beautiful mountain where there is a temple, and the figure of Manhei and the centrality of poetry and culture and language for those people. I mean, for Koreans, their language, the country was so colonized and bullied and exploited, notably by the Japanese Empire. That trip was like an object lesson in what Czesław says in the poem Ars Poetica. You're part of the whole world, and your language, I dare call it my language, English. It was not the language of any of my great-grandparents. How many do we have? We have 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents. Of those 8 people, they spoke probably most of them Yiddish and 1 or 2 other Eastern European languages. But my ancestor, my grandfather Wallace Stevens, and my great-great-great-grandfather George Herbert gave me this language. And anybody can come in.
On that note, I think we might have to end. We could talk for days and days. Thank you, Robert. It's been such a great pleasure.
Yes, thank you so much. So much insight. It's a fabulous event.
Thank you, Chard.
Really
Thank you,
appreciate you being
Sandy.
here.
And thanks, Connie Post.
Don't forget to donate if you can, and everybody have a great weekend.
Yeah. Thank you all.
Thank you, Robert.
Pleasure.